Hello everyone. Well, we've come to the final talk of our Daniel series. I wonder if you've been reading along. It's a pretty epic read. We've thought about how Daniel and his friends had intrinsic faith that empowered them to remain faithful and distinctive as God's people, even when taken into exile into Babylon, with their outward visible anchors of faith removed. Is our faith intrinsic, baked in? We've been challenged to have an acoustic faith like Daniel, who listened both to the culture around him and to God's voice as he engaged honestly and faithfully with Nebuchadnezzar, interpreting his dream. Are we listening? We saw the faith of Daniel's devoted friends stretched as they refused to bow to idols, their elastic faith unbroken by the threat of the fiery furnace and strengthened by another in the fire. How elastic is your faith today? And we heard last week of God's ultimate power and authority, demonstrated in the writing on the wall and explained in Daniel's poetic faith, a faith that recognized God's creative communication with his people and the world. Are we ready to hear from God? And that's not even including Daniel and the lion's den. If you want to hear that story, you can head to the St. George's Tots Facebook page. It's enough to say that praying, while a private act, always has public consequences. Today we're going to look at chapter 7 and beyond, starting zoomed in with the first of Daniel's visions in a dream, and then zooming out to get a panoramic view of the story of God and his world. I wonder if you have any panoramic photos in your home or on your phone. A panoramic shot allows you to see a wide view, normally of a landscape. I have 3 of my favourites behind me from a study trip I took to Israel. Of the Jordanian desert, where Jesus would have walked, tempted, hungry and thirsty. One of the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus walked on water. And one from the Qumran caves, where some of their ancient scriptural manuscripts were discovered. This always encourages me in my faith as I think of those places where the historic Jesus walked and talked and preached and performed miracles. Panoramic shots give us a zoomed out perspective, a grander view. In Daniel chapter 7, we read the first of Daniel's dreams and visions. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, the previous king of Babylon, had a dream back in chapter 2 that Daniel interpreted for him. Daniel said that the statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about, made of 4 different types of metal, symbolized a sequence of kingdoms that would follow after Babylon. One day, however, God's kingdom of peace would come, humbling the proud and filling the earth with healing and justice. Chapter 7 pairs with chapter 2 in the book's structure, but this time it's Daniel's dream and he needs help interpreting it. We're going to hear the beginning of chapter 7 now, performed by Priscilla, speaking as Daniel. The dream is both an account of Daniel's experience and also a piece of literature. The symbolism found in the dream is rooted in the whole Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament. Whether the imagery we hear is exactly what Daniel experienced, or that the experience has been recorded in such a way to alert the reader to other parts of God's big story, doesn't matter so much, and it's probably a mixture of the two. You might notice the symbolism of many horns, a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament, and the symbol of a son of man for God's people, an image of God's covenant people and their king from the line of David. So as we hear the dream, allow your imagination to wake up, picturing this awesome dream in your mind's eye as you hear the words of Daniel.
In my vision in the night, I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the other, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was raised from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human being was given to it. And there before me was another beast which looked like a bear, and it was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." And after that, in my vision, I looked, and there before me was another beast which looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird, and this beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After this, in my vision in the night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had iron teeth, and it crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. And while I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow, and the hair on his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept watching until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the flaming fire. The other beasts were stripped of their authority, but they were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision in the night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority and glory and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion was an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind, it disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there, and I asked him the meaning of all this.
Daniel's dream is full of symbolic imagery, and at first we might be put off by this style of writing as we read and listen. Or maybe you love it, I don't know. What we find in these later chapters is what's known as apocalyptic literature, full of this symbolism and imagery. It's helpful to think of content over style when we read this kind of writing, to look where the imagery points and not to be put off by the imaginative and symbolic style. That's why I asked Priscilla to speak straight to us as Daniel, because these passages are much better read aloud and listened to and imagined, inviting our imaginations to paint the scenes in our minds. And the better we know our Old Testament, the better we'll connect the dots of the imagery used. Daniel says the dream and interpretation leave him deeply disturbed, troubled in his thoughts, his face turned pale. Do we often have that reaction when we read scripture? God invites us to engage all our senses and emotions as we read God's big story. Daniel asks one of the figures in the dream for an interpretation and discovers that the different beasts represent different arrogant kingdoms, the fourth being a particularly evil empire. But the Ancient of Days, God, will come and pronounce judgment on these kingdoms. And in verse 27, the sovereignty, power and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey. The Son of Man, the Ancient of Days, these are the figures that will triumph with mercy, judgment and peace forever. This dream encourages patience and perspective for Daniel, who waits for God to bring his rule over the world and vindicate his people. But when will God do this? Well, chapters 8 to 12 explore this with further visions and Daniel praying for forgiveness on behalf of God's people. There's not time to go through each of those chapters now, but they're worth a read, and they're the same sequence of kingdoms from Daniel's dream in chapter 7, explored further in those later visions. Daniel discovers that the people of God will remain in exile for much longer than the prophet Jeremiah predicted. Now, there's lots of debates about when exactly all those events would take place. Was it with the Syrian king, Antiochus, in the 160s BC? Were they fulfilled in the Roman Empire's destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD? Or is it all still to come when Jesus returns? This is when remembering what apocalyptic really means can be helpful. Rather than thinking specifically about the end of the world, apocalypse means to reveal, for God to pull back the curtain, for God to reveal something of himself, true reality, his character, what's really going on in the world. This happens when Isaiah is transported in a vision to the heavenly throne room, gaining a divine perspective on Israel's past, present, and future. Paul has his own apocalypse when he sees the risen Jesus. God reveals himself, and it changes Paul's life forever. Ezekiel sees valleys of dry bones come to life, streams of living water, revealing what God will do in the world. So one major theme of this type of writing is that while human beings and human kingdoms rise and fall, God's kingdom will be established and exist forever. This zoomed out view reminds God's people to have hope in all generations, all seasons of life, because the final battle has been won. I've been struck as I've read through Daniel how much he reminds me, or maybe points me towards, the person of Jesus. I think Jesus on the earth in his reading and inhabiting of the Hebrew Bible was inspired by and drawn to Daniel as he journeyed into his vocation, his identity as the Son of Man, the Messiah, the servant king. The panoramic faith of Daniel can help us zoom into the person of Jesus. This is my zoomed in photo of a stained glass window from my last church, Holminster. It reminds me of who is at the centre of my faith: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Reading Daniel should point us to Jesus, the one promised in Daniel's dreams and exemplified in Daniel's faithful life. Daniel, a man, came into a culture that did not recognize Yahweh as creator or king. Jesus, the God-man, entered a world that did not recognize him, even though he created it. Daniel, a man, held an uncompromising faithfulness to God and worshipped him even when it meant suffering. Jesus, the God-man, held an uncompromising faithfulness to God and proclaimed the kingdom, even though he knew it would take him to the cross. Daniel, a man, was sealed in a den of death with a stone rolled across the entrance, threatened by a human kingdom. He was rescued by God's power over the lions, over creation. Jesus, the God-man, was sealed in a tomb with a stone rolled across the entrance, having been killed by a human kingdom. He rose from the dead, rescuing us, death unable to defeat his indestructible life. Reading Daniel's visions, gaining this panoramic faith, should also renew our perspective, which in turn renews our purpose today. We've been using Gerard Kelly's book Stretch as a bit of inspiration for this sermon series. And he says about Daniel, Daniel's capacity to thrive in exile can be partly attributed to his grand vision of the future. So convinced is he of God's ultimate sovereignty, he's prepared to live out his own life in patient service, knowing that the people of God, whether now or in a future generation, will ultimately experience the fulfillment of God's plans. The New Testament book of the Revelation of John, which draws heavily on the imagery of Daniel, fits the same purpose for the new-found Christians of Asia Minor. The message of both Daniel and John is the same. If you base your faith only on the realities you see here and now, you will flounder and lose hope. But if your anchor sinks deep into God's future promises, it will hold you through the worst of storms. And I think that's true. It's good for us. It's even good for our biological eyes in our body to be having a field of vision that's not just close up. I was talking to a friend recently about how much time we've spent on computers and on Zoom during lockdown, and how he'd only realised recently that he'd looked into the middle distance for the first time in quite a while. It's good for our eyes and our body to look further ahead, and it's good for our hearts and our faith as well. Knowing that God's kingdom has begun and continues to be established, that we have a living hope in the resurrected Jesus, gives us hope and courage to play our part in God's kingdom today. We partner with God, just as Daniel and his friends did, living faithfully, giving our worship to the only one who is worthy. We know that our present circumstances, the injustices in the world and in human systems and structures, do not have the final say. Again, Kelly says, this doesn't stop me from reaching out for healing, from railing against injustice, from seeking freedom, from wrestling with the sin that resists my completion. I yearn for these things because I do want to know more now of the realities of God's future reign. But in my yearning for these things, I am not frightened that they are victories I will never see. I do not fight as one who expects ultimately to lose. I know that God has set in motion the forces of liberation, that he has released resurrection into the created order to run with its muddy boots all over death's plans for us, that he will bring to fruition every good work for redemption that he has begun. So I am able to live in patience and hope, accepting the not yet of the kingdom as fully as I accept the now. One video I saw recently on Facebook that featured Metab, who's part of our congregation, and Rosie, our children's pastor, was of them dancing in the rain in a recent thunderstorm. And it reminded me a bit of this image of perspective. It's not about that cheesy fridge magnet line of, dance like nobody's watching, based on optimism. But the idea that during this storm, they felt they could go out and dance because they knew the thunderstorm would end, just painted a picture for me, even as I scrolled through social media, of what it might be like to have our perspective and our purpose changed by knowing the future victory of God in Jesus. And that might not be what you do, dancing in the rain when there's a storm, but there might be circumstances and situations that you're thinking of where you need God's future hope to influence your feelings and your prayer even now. How might a panoramic perspective of kingdom hope shape your kingdom purpose today? As we close this series on Daniel, I wanted to close with the last chapter, chapter 12, which is read to us by Lydia. And Daniel is being explained to about the future, but then he also speaks again directly to us through Lydia.
At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress, such as has not happened since the beginning until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. But those who are wise will shine like the brightest of heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, roll up and seal the words in the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase your knowledge. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there before me stood two others, one on this bank of the river and one on the opposite bank. One of them said to the man, clothed in linen, stood above the waters of the river, "How long will it be before these astonishing things will be fulfilled?" The man, clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, lifted his right hand and then lifted his left hand. And I heard him swear by him who lives forever, saying, "It will be for a time, times, and half a time when the power of the holy people has finally been broken, and all these things will be completed." I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked my Lord, "What will the outcome of this be?" He replied, "Go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed in the scroll until the time of the end. Many will be purified, made spotless, and redefined. But those who are wicked will remain wicked. Those who are wicked will not understand, but those who are wise will understand. From that time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there'll be 1,290 days. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches till the end of the 1,335 days. As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest, and then at the end of the days you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance."
So the last verse of Daniel invites the listener to continue to go your way and rest. Not a passive rest, waiting around to do nothing. We know that Jesus in the Gospels warns against that. But an active rest that acknowledges God's ultimate power and authority. We continue on being faithful, alert, distinctive in exile, wherever we are. We partner with God in the coming of his kingdom. But we also rest. We rest in the assurance that what happened in the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ has a cosmic impact. We have a living hope, a hope of renewal, of justice, of peace, of resurrection. So as we close this series on Daniel, let's rest now in prayer, bringing to him the things that we've been thinking about in this series, but listening for his voice as well.